June 25, 1941, near Minsk, Belarusian SSR, the low growl of diesel engines rolled across the horizon. Smoke drifted over the battered fields where, just days before, the Wehrmacht had swept through Soviet defenses like a steel tide. Panzer crews stood beside their vehicles, listening. It wasn't the familiar thrum of German Maybach engines they heard now. This sound was deeper, heavier, almost animalistic. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Reuter of the 7th Panzer Division squinted through his binoculars. "Panzer alarm," someone muttered, but Reuter didn't see panzers. He saw something broader, lower to the ground, strange, angled armor glinting through the dust. Moments later, Soviet shells ripped into the German advance column. A T-34 rumbled into view, its 76.2 mm cannon belching fire. One Panzer III disintegrated, its turret hurled skyward like a toy. Reuter felt his gut twist. The shells from his own 50 mm gun bounced harmlessly off the Soviet tank's sloped armor. The battlefield descended into chaos. Radios crackled with disbelief. "Impossible. The Russians don't have this kind of tank," shouted one operator, but they did, and there were more of them than anyone expected. By nightfall, the German line was forced to regroup. Intelligence officers scrambled to identify the new Soviet machines. Reports poured in, fast, heavily armored, powerful gun. The code word began to circulate, T-34.to the engineers back in Berlin. This was a nightmare. German tank designers had prided themselves on technological superiority, precision engineering, meticulous craftsmanship. But the T-34 was something else entirely. Crude yet brilliant, rugged yet agile, built not in small numbers but by the thousands. What no one in the German high command realized then, as Reuter's men abandoned their wrecked panzers under the glow of burning oil, was that this tank was only the beginning. Behind it lay an industrial miracle no Western nation had ever attempted. The Soviet Union was about to do something unthinkable, move its entire war industry thousands of kilometers east, and make it work. July 1941, Moscow, Kremlin War Council chamber. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and urgency. Stalin sat silent at the head of the long oak table, a pipe clenched between his teeth, eyes fixed on a map covered with red pins inching dangerously close to Moscow. Around him, ministers of industry and defense shuffled nervously. Anastas Mikoyan, People's Commissar of Trade, leaned forward. "Comrade Stalin, the Germans are advancing faster than expected. Our Western factories will be overrun within weeks." Across the table, Lazar Kaganovich slammed his fist down. "Then we move them. Machines, workers, everything. East, to the Urals, to Siberia, anywhere the Luftwaffe can't reach." Silence. The proposal was insane. To relocate entire industrial cities, dismantle blast furnaces, lathe machines, production lines, load them onto railcars, and rebuild them thousands of kilometers away, was unprecedented. But Stalin didn't flinch. "Do it," he said simply. "Not one machine for the Germans." Within hours, orders spread through the ministries. The greatest logistical evacuation in human history had begun. In Kharkov, foreman Ivan Derevyenko stood atop a railcar under the dim light of a flickering lamp. Sparks flew as workers unbolted massive steel presses and loaded them onto flatbeds. Women packed blueprints into crates, machinists wrapped tools in cloth. The distant thunder of artillery was already audible. "You think we'll ever see this city again?" a young worker asked, his face streaked with grime. Ivan looked eastward, toward the faint red glow of dawn. "If we live long enough to build it again, maybe." By August, entire factory towns were on the move. Over 1,500 industrial plants were dismantled, crated, and shipped eastward in what became known as the Great Evacuation. The railways groaned under the strain. Endless trains of machinery, livestock, refugees, and soldiers rolled through smoke and snow toward the heart of Russia. The Ural Mountains, barren fields were transformed overnight into industrial cities. In Nizhny Tagil, workers hammered together wooden barracks beside the rail lines. They slept on straw, their breath freezing in the air. But even before roofs were complete, machine tools were reassembled and production resumed. By September, the Germans had captured Smolensk and approached Leningrad. Yet far behind the front, something extraordinary was happening. A new Soviet war machine was awakening. Amid the roar of furnaces and the clang of hammers, the first relocated assembly lines began to produce again. Not airplanes or artillery yet, but tanks. The T-34, reborn in exile, began rolling out of makeshift plants at a staggering pace. The German high command couldn't comprehend it. In Berlin, reports arrived claiming that Soviet factories destroyed in June were producing tanks again by October. Nonsense, scoffed General Halder. They cannot build under those conditions. But they could, and they did. Every mile the Wehrmacht advanced westward, the Soviets seemed to replace their losses twice over. At the front, Lieutenant Reuter and his men noticed it too. Each week, more Soviet tanks appeared, sometimes fresh from the factory, still painted with the grime of transport. "They're building them faster than we can destroy them," one gunner whispered. That he wasn't wrong. By late 1942, the USSR had achieved something no European power had dared to dream, an entire industrial base resurrected in the wilderness, powered by women, teenagers, and old men working around the clock under banners reading, "For the front. For victory. For the motherland." October 1941, Nizhny Tagil, Sverdlovsk Oblast, deep in the Ural Mountains, snow fell in thick sheets across a city that technically didn't exist 6 months ago. Its name was simple, Urovagonzavod, a name destined to be whispered with awe by engineers and soldiers alike. The skeletal frames of new workshops rose beside the tracks, their roofs still half open to the cold. Workers labored by torchlight, bundled in wool and rags. Sparks illuminated their faces like fireflies in the frozen dark. At the heart of it all stood a T-34, its armor plates covered in frost, its turret yet to be mounted. Beside it, a young woman named Yelena Korikova, only 19, guided a welding torch along the steel seam. Her breath fogged her goggles. Her hands trembled, but her welds held. The foreman barked orders, "No breaks until the next shift." Every hour, a tank, every tank, a bullet for the Germans. And so, they built. The line never stopped. When machinery failed, they repaired it with scrap. When parts ran out, they scavenged replacements from derailed trains. Meals were black bread and thin soup, eaten beside roaring furnaces. The Soviets had perfected a brutal efficiency, simplicity over precision, quantity over elegance. The T-34 embodied this philosophy. Sloped armor deflected shells that would penetrate heavier tanks. Its wide tracks glided through mud and snow where German panzers bogged down. And its diesel engine, crude but powerful, could run on almost anything. To the Soviet mind, the T-34 wasn't just a machine. It was a worker's tank, easy to build, easy to repair, and, most importantly, easy to replace. In contrast, in Stuttgart, Germany, the Panzer Commission convened. Engineers debated rivets, optics, and metallurgy under bright lamps and classical portraits. Every design change required signatures, measurements, blueprints. Precision ensures victory, one engineer insisted, but precision was slow. The Panzer III and IV, mechanical masterpieces, took weeks to assemble and demanded high-grade steel the Reich could no longer afford. When German intelligence intercepted reports of Soviet factories operating in the Urals, disbelief turned to irritation, then fear. "They're producing intense," one officer scoffed. "Yes," another replied grimly, "but they're producing." Back in Nizhny Tagil, night merged into day. The clang of hammers became a lullaby of survival. In December, Luftwaffe bombers attempted a rare strike, guided by rumor. They found only smoke and snow. The factories were buried under camouflage netting, their heat signatures masked by decoy fires. Yelena worked through the air raid, sparks dancing around her as bombs fell miles away. The next morning, she watched a convoy of freshly built T-34s roll out toward the west. The drivers saluted the workers as they passed. teenagers in oil-stained uniforms waving back with soot-covered hands. Send them our greetings, the foreman called after the departing tanks. And our revenge. The first winter of the evacuation had broken men, but not production. By early 1942, the relocated Soviet plants were producing more tanks than before the invasion, a feat so improbable that German analysts dismissed it as propaganda, yet every burned-out panzer on the Eastern Front told a different story. The factory that shouldn't have existed, that rose from snow and ruin, had become the beating heart of Soviet resistance. And while the Germans calculated barrel thickness and armor slope, the Soviets calculated something else entirely: how many tanks could they build before dawn? January 1942, east of Moscow, near Mozhaysk, snowstorms swallowed the front lines in a white blur. Temperatures dropped below -30. Engines froze, rifles jammed, and soldiers died standing up in the cold. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Reuter crouched beside his Panzer III, trying to coax life back into its engine. Verdammt, he hissed through chattering teeth. The oil was sludge. Around him, the men were gaunt and frostbitten. The Soviet counteroffensive had begun, and German armor, once the unstoppable spearhead of Barbarossa, was now being hunted. Through the mist came the low, familiar rumble again. Soviet tanks, T-34s, emerging from the tree line like ghosts. Their engines roared in the cold as if winter itself couldn't touch them. Reuter grabbed his field glasses. He counted 12, all with fresh paint, no mud, no rust. Impossible. These machines couldn't have come from the front. They were new. How? His gunner muttered. We've destroyed hundreds. Thousands. Reuter had no answer. Behind those tanks lay a story of arithmetic, one of steel, sweat, and strategy. While the Wehrmacht struggled to maintain supply lines through snow-choked roads, Soviet planners in the State Defense Committee were conducting a different kind of warfare, the warfare of numbers. Each tank destroyed at the front was immediately replaced in the ledgers. Not by name, not by serial number, just by count. Tank destroyed, tank ordered, tank produced. It was as impersonal as it was relentless. In the Urovagonzavod plant, quotas were nailed to walls beside portraits of Stalin. Every day's output was marked in red chalk. The slogan above every line read, "Not 1 minute idle. Not one machine silent." By spring 1942, production across the Soviet interior reached staggering levels: over 1,200 tanks per month, thousands of artillery pieces, and millions of rounds of ammunition. And these weren't just machines. They were declarations of defiance. For every Soviet tank destroyed, 2 more would take its place. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the atmosphere had changed. Reports from the Eastern Front painted a grim picture: losses rising, replacements lagging. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of the Blitzkrieg, warned the OKH, "Our tanks are superior in training, but inferior in time. We cannot replace as fast as we lose." The German war industry was strangled by its own obsession with perfection. Each tank was a marvel, but it was also a masterpiece of over-engineering. The Tiger and Panther projects, still in development, promised unmatched firepower, yet required time, precision, and scarce materials. The Soviets, on the other hand, had redefined what quality meant in wartime: a tank that could be built in days, repaired in hours, and sacrificed in minutes, if it meant victory. At Urovagonzavod, Yelena and her team had begun welding the new model, the T-34/76 mod. 1942, its armor was simplified for easier production, its parts interchangeable. They even cut the number of bolts to save time. "Every bolt saved," said the foreman, "is a second closer to victory." Sometimes, the workers wrote messages on the armor before the paint dried: "For Mama at Smolensk. For the fallen at Kiev. For the motherland." And when those tanks rolled west, each one carried not just steel, but vengeance. As spring thawed the frozen steppes, Reuter watched yet another Soviet formation crest the hills near Vyazma. The sight made his blood run cold. The Germans had come to the east believing they would crush an inferior enemy. Instead, they found themselves drowning in an ocean of armor, one tank at a time, and somewhere behind those endless convoys of T-34s, in a snowbound city of factories that never slept, Soviet engineers were already drawing the blueprints for the next generation. The Red War machine had learned how to breathe under fire. March 1942, Chelyabinsk, nicknamed Tankigrad. The rail yard shook like an earthquake. Flat cars clattered in from the west, carrying the skeletons of bombed factories from Leningrad and Kharkov. Men in fur-lined caps and women in heavy coats moved like shadows through the steam, directing cranes that hoisted entire turret molds and press frames from the trains. Chelyabinsk had once been a quiet industrial town. Now it was the largest tank production complex on Earth. Engineers joked grimly that the city's new anthem was the Hammer Song. Its skyline was a horizon of smoke, flame, and red stars, a forest of chimneys and cranes. A line worker named Sergei Voronov, once a tractor mechanic, now supervised a welding section of 40 teenage boys and girls. He had no military training, but his work orders came directly from Moscow. "We build as if every machine we touch is for our own sons," he told them. "Because one day, it will be." Every hour, a whistle shrieked through the foundries. Each blast meant another T-34 rolling off the line. The factory operated on 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, with no true distinction between day and night. The workers slept in dormitories beside the furnaces, blankets reeking of oil and smoke. When one shift collapsed from exhaustion, another stepped over them to continue. Meals were black bread, kasha, and sometimes soup thickened with sawdust. Yet no one complained, not aloud. Soviet propaganda posters adorned every wall, declaring, "Every tank you build crushes a fascist. Stalin's armor is forged in your hands." The workers repeated these slogans like prayers. At the same time, German engineers at Henschel and Mann were finishing blueprints for the Panther and Tiger tanks. These were masterpieces, fearsome, elegant, deadly. But they demanded precise machining, rare alloys, and months of careful assembly. By the time the first Tiger battalions reached the front in 1942, the Soviets had already produced over 12,000 T-34s. German mechanics opened the hatches of captured T-34s and were astonished by their simplicity. No delicate gears, no excess fittings, just thick steel, straightforward controls, and a rugged engine that could be repaired with a wrench and a hammer. A Wehrmacht engineer famously remarked, "They build them like we build farm tools, but they work." Inside the Chelyabinsk plant, the assembly lines stretched like rivers of molten light. Sparks flew in cascades, echoing against the steel frames. Women hammered rivets into armor plates. Boys barely old enough to shave tightened bolts with gloved hands twice their size. Sergei's section welded the hull seams, where armor met destiny. The air was suffocating with the smell of metal and smoke, but he kept count in his logbook: 47 completed this week, 53 last week. Never less, always more. When a shipment of armor plate failed to arrive, they cut steel from old locomotives and melted it down. When a batch of bolts froze during a blizzard, they thawed them over open fires. In this brutal calculus of production, nothing stopped. Meanwhile, in the field near Rezev, Lieutenant Reuter's Panzer Battalion faced wave after wave of Soviet armor. He watched in disbelief as the same model of tank appeared again and again, the same shape, the same sound, the same deadly silhouette rising from the smoke. He wrote in his field journal that night, "It feels as though the earth itself manufactures them. For every one we destroy, another 10 crawl from the ground." He was not far from the truth. By summer 1942, the Soviet Union's relocated industrial base was not only replacing losses, it was outproducing Germany 2-1. The Red Army was no longer desperate, it was methodical, mechanical, and confident. The Germans could measure the efficiency of their factories in hours, the Soviets measured theirs in blood. Every spark that flew from a Chelyabinsk welder's torch carried the same message to the front: "We are still here. And we are building faster than you can kill us." The balance of the Eastern Front was shifting, not in the trenches, but in the factories of the frozen East, and as the tanks rolled westward, the name, Tankigrad, became legend, whispered among German soldiers like a curse. July 1942, Chelyabinsk, Ural Mountains. The sun never fully rose here, it was swallowed by the smoke. The city glowed orange day and night, its horizon crowned with the flicker of foundry fires. Tankograd was alive, breathing, roaring, growing. Sergei Voronov stood at the edge of the assembly line, rubbing a hand across his face blackened with soot. He hadn't slept in 2 days. Around him, hundreds of men and women moved with clockwork rhythm. The factory's heartbeat never slowed, pistons, presses, welders, cranes, all pounding in unison. "Comrade Sergei," shouted Yelena, the young welder who transferred from Nizhny Tagil. She held up a torch, sputtering weakly. "No acetylene again." The line stalling. He nodded, already knowing the answer. They'd been forced to ration gas for weeks. "Use oxygen, cut shallow. Finish the seam. But it'll crack under stress. Then reinforce it with faith," he said, smiling grimly. "That's all we've got left." She returned the grin and went back to work. Every tank completed that day, 37 in total, was immediately rolled onto flat cars bound for the Stalingrad front. The paint was still drying on their hulls when locomotives pulled away, horns wailing like cries through the night. The trains didn't stop for inspection or ceremony. Tankograd didn't celebrate production milestones. It simply kept moving, one steel heartbeat at a time. Far to the southwest, Stalingrad was already under siege. The city's ruins echoed with gunfire, and Soviet troops clung to the banks of the Volga like ghosts. By late August, over half the tanks defending the city bore the stamp of Chelyabinsk. Some were so new that workers' chalk markings were still visible under the soot, names of loved ones, hometowns, and phrases scrawled in trembling Cyrillic. "From Tankograd, with vengeance." In one such T-34, crew commander Alexei Makarov, 24, led his platoon through the shattered streets. His gunner, 19-year-old Oleg, noticed a faint etching on the inside of the turret, built by Yelena. "Whoever she is," Makarov said, smiling grimly, "she just saved our lives." The T-34's sloped armor deflected a Panzer III's shell with a metallic scream, leaving only a dent. The Soviet tank retaliated, 1 shot, 1 kill. Smoke billowed as the German vehicle burst into flame. Makarov didn't know that Yelena, hundreds of miles away, was working another 16-hour shift, oblivious to the fate of the tanks she built. But in a sense, she was there, her welds, her seams, her sweat holding the armor together under fire. Meanwhile, German reconnaissance reports began arriving in Berlin. They spoke of an unending stream of Soviet armor, appearing faster than the Wehrmacht could count. Factories supposedly bombed months earlier were producing again, stronger than before. At OKH headquarters, General Franz Halder slammed his pencil down onto the map. "They are manufacturing tanks in the wilderness. Do you understand? The wilderness." Intelligence officers nodded uneasily. Photographs confirmed the unbelievable: industrial cities built in forests, rail yards extending into the tundra, endless columns of supply trains moving east to west. The Germans, bound by perfectionism and hierarchy, were watching an empire built on chaos and necessity eclipse them through sheer willpower. Back in Tankograd, the ministry's production targets increased again, 100 tanks per day. The quota was impossible, but so was everything else they had already achieved. Sergei read the order pinned to the wall: "Those who cannot reach the target will be replaced by those who can." He didn't argue. He simply turned to his workers and said, "Let's build 101." And they did. When the first snows of autumn fell, Chelyabinsk's chimneys spewed fire brighter than ever. The war had turned into an inferno, and Tankograd was its furnace. From these foundries came not just steel, but a generation, boys who had never seen the front but fought through their work, women who carried torches instead of rifles, children who grew up to the rhythm of machinery, not lullabies. They called them Tankograd's children, the nameless army behind the Red Army. Their hands never touched the battlefield, yet every victory from the Volga to Kursk bore their fingerprints in steel. November 1942, Moscow. The air outside the Kremlin windows shimmered with the faint glow of aurora across the polar sky. a cruelly beautiful reminder that winter was back, and so was Soviet confidence. Inside a war room lit by dim lamps, Stalin listened in silence as Georgy Malenkov read from a report freshly arrived from the Urals. Comrade Stalin, Tankograd reports 2,253 T-34s produced last month. Nizhny Tagil, 1,789. Gorky and Omsk, combined 900. A pause, total monthly output, 4,942 tanks. The numbers hung in the air like artillery blasts. Even Stalin's stony face shifted slightly. That figure meant something extraordinary. For the first time since the invasion began, the Soviet Union was outproducing the entire German tank industry combined. He leaned back, exhaled a plume of smoke, and muttered, "Good. Now let's make it 5,000 every month." While German troops still pressed toward the Volga at Stalingrad, something fundamental had changed in the mathematics of war. The Soviets had turned production itself into a weapon, one as decisive as any gun or plane. In Berlin, Albert Speer, soon to become Minister of Armaments, reviewed Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographs of Soviet industrial zones. He noted the same patterns: enormous workshops rising from snow, workers' barracks spreading like roots into the forests, railway yards crowded with flat cars stacked with tank turrets. "They have achieved a miracle," Speer admitted quietly. "And we underestimated them completely." The German war machine had been designed for quick wars, short and precise, blitzkrieg, lightning victory. But now it faced an enemy built for attrition, endurance, and cold. The Wehrmacht's armor units reported diminishing returns. Tiger I tanks required up to 300,000 man-hours to construct. Each T-34 required fewer than 10,000. For every Tiger rolling out of Kassel, 10 Soviet tanks were already crossing the steppe, far from those boardrooms and offices. The miracle continued to unfold in the east. At Eurovagonzavad, Yelena Korotkova had long since stopped counting the tanks she welded. Her fingers were raw from burns, her hair perpetually coated with soot. But her spirit had hardened. She no longer dreamed of rest, only of completion. The radio above her workbench crackled with the deep, triumphant voice of Yuri Levitan, the famous Soviet announcer. "Our Red Army has encircled the fascist forces at Stalingrad. Victory is near." The factory roared with cheers. Men hugged each other, women cried openly. But within minutes, the whistle blew again, the next shift began, the sparks resumed, and production continued without pause. Even joy was rationed. At Stalingrad itself, Sergeant Alexei Makarov's T-34 rolled through a hellscape of twisted girders and ash. His crew hadn't slept in 2 days. The tank bore deep scars from artillery impacts, yet it still ran. Inside, Oleg, his gunner, leaned over the radio. "Command says we've got reinforcements coming," he said. "More T-34s from the Urals." Makarov smirked tiredly. "Of course we do. The Urals never sleep." Moments later, their tank rumbled forward again, joining dozens of others pushing the Germans toward the river. Across the Volga, the supply ferries carried fuel, ammunition, and replacements, a direct lifeline from the factories Yelena and Sergei called home. When the last German strongholds in Stalingrad fell in February 1943, the Soviets did not celebrate with champagne or parades. They celebrated with production reports. Tankograd sent a telegram to the front: "We send our greetings to the victors of Stalingrad. 3,012 new tanks await your orders." That message terrified Berlin more than the defeat itself, because behind every Soviet counterattack now stood an assembly line. Behind every victory, a locomotive loaded with new steel. The Germans could win battles, the Soviets could replace armies, and as the snow melted and the mud returned to the steppe, both sides prepared for something that would define the war's future, a contest not of strategy, but of sheer industrial willpower. The war of machines had begun in earnest. August 1943, Magnitogorsk, Ural Mountains. The nights were colder now, and the wind from the steppe carried the scent of coal and metal across the sleeping valley. Except no one was sleeping. Not in Tankograd. Not in Magnitogorsk. Not in the ghost cities that had sprung from the tundra. The furnaces roared through the darkness like volcanoes, their glow visible for miles. Sparks rained from open smelters, casting long shadows on faces smeared with soot. Every clang of a hammer, every hiss of molten steel, was another heartbeat in the Soviet war machine. At the base of blast furnace number 8, Foreman Sergei Petrovich stood watching the molten river pour into the molds. It had been 2 years since he last saw Moscow, 2 years since the evacuation trains carried him, his wife, and his tools eastward. Now, the mountains themselves felt like his home. "Comrade Petrovich," shouted a young worker, barely 17, his face streaked with grime. "The German bombs missed the plant again." Sergei smiled faintly. The Luftwaffe had tried long-range raids, desperate night missions. But the Soviets had learned to hide an entire factory beneath camouflage nets, false villages, and forest canopies. Some facilities were dug directly into mountainsides. Even when the bombs fell, production never stopped. If a building was destroyed, they worked outside. If machines broke, they were repaired with melted scrap. The rhythm never faltered. In his logbook, Sergei wrote, "Steel flows like blood. No rest. No silence. No defeat." The German army could no longer comprehend the scale of what they faced. In 1941, they had believed the Soviet Union would collapse in months. In 1942, they thought the Red Army's strength was an illusion. But by late 1943, German field intelligence began reporting something unthinkable, that Soviet industry had grown larger than before the war began. Factories once destroyed or captured had been rebuilt behind the Urals, larger and more efficient. Entire production lines had been re-engineered to simplify and accelerate output. A German officer captured near Smolensk recalled the disbelief in his report: "The Russians build tanks as if they were loaves of bread. There is no end to them." And indeed, by late 1943, the Soviets were producing 200 tanks per month from Uralvagonzavod alone. 35,000 tanks and self-propelled guns in that year alone, more than all German armor combined. For every Tiger that left the assembly line in Kassel, 10 T-34s rolled out from Nizhny Tagil. The mathematics of war had turned against Germany. In Berlin, the mood grew grim. Engineers from Henschel and Mann factories presented new blueprints: the Tiger II, the Panther F, technological marvels. But even they admitted the truth: they were too complex, too costly, too few. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments, stared at the production graphs in disbelief. The Reich's factories, bombed by Allied raids, crippled by shortages, simply couldn't match the Soviet tempo. "Even if our tanks are superior," Speer said quietly, "it means nothing if they are outnumbered 10-1. Meanwhile, in the Urals, the Soviets had achieved something extraordinary: industrial choreography. Each part of a T-34 came from a different city: steel from Magnitogorsk, engines from Chelyabinsk, optics from Sverdlovsk, turrets from Nizhny Tagil, and all of it arrived just in time, every time. Often by women and children driving locomotives through snowstorms and bombed rail lines. It wasn't efficiency born of comfort. It was efficiency born of desperation. One night in November, Sergei walked through the assembly hall where finished tanks lined the floor like sleeping beasts. Snow fell through holes in the roof, melting on the still warm steel. A young woman, her uniform several sizes too large, climbed onto a turret and painted the final words before the shipment left for the front: "For the motherland. For my brother." Sergei watched silently. He knew she meant it. Everyone did. The cost was measured in lives: her brother, his sons, countless others. But as long as the factories burned bright, their deaths had meaning. The next morning, the train whistle echoed across the valley. Flat cars loaded with fresh T-34s rumbled westward, their tracks biting through the frost. From the cab of the lead engine, a conductor waved his cap and shouted over the roar: "To Berlin." It wasn't bravado anymore. It was prophecy, because the Soviets no longer built tanks to defend, they built them to advance, and as 1943 gave way to 1944, that advance would become unstoppable. January 1944, near the Dnieper River, central Ukraine, the wind howled across the frozen plains as columns of Soviet tanks crawled westward, their treads grinding through ice and mud. The sun was nothing more than a pale disk behind clouds of exhaust. Soldiers huddled on tank hulls, faces wrapped in scarves, rifles clutched against the cold. At the head of one column rumbled a T-34/85, its new 85mm gun glinting beneath the gray sky. Inside sat Sergeant Alexei Volkov, a mechanic from Chelyabinsk turned tank commander. His crew had named their machine Odvaga, courage. The word was scratched into the side in white paint, half frozen under layers of grime. Alexei adjusted the periscope, watching the road ahead. Burned villages. Abandoned guns. The remnants of the once mighty Wehrmacht retreating west, blowing bridges behind them. The Red Army wasn't stopping anymore. Every kilometer they advanced was paid for in blood, but the Soviets had something the Germans no longer did: endless replacements. Behind every destroyed tank came another, and another, each one newly minted, fresh from the furnaces of the Urals. Back in Nizhny Tagil, the Uralvagonzavod plant was running at full fury. The factory sirens never fell silent. Shifts rotated without pause. Day workers passed the line to night crews to morning crews, a cycle that blurred into eternity. Sergei Petrovich, still at his post, oversaw the new model's rollout, the T-34/85. Its longer barrel, thicker armor, and three-man turret gave Soviet crews a fighting chance against the Panthers and Tigers they would soon meet in the west. That he ran his calloused hand over the new turret one evening, feeling the weld seams. "Good," he muttered. "It'll take a hit and keep moving." By now, the workers knew the rhythm of war as intimately as breathing. Trains came daily, bearing letters from the front, sometimes from soldiers who had driven the very tanks they'd built. One letter pinned to the bulletin board read, "To the comrades of Uralvagonzavod, your tank carried us across the Dnieper. We reached the German line at dawn. The T-34 burned, but we lived. Thank you for the steel that saved us." That letter made the rounds, passed from soot-streaked hands to trembling fingers. Some wept. Others smiled silently, tightening their gloves and returning to work. At the front, the Germans were learning a terrible new reality. A Tiger commander near Kirovograd wrote in his diary, "We destroy them by the dozens, but still they come. They appear from behind the forests, across the rivers, from nowhere. Our shells cannot silence their factories." The Wehrmacht had lost the initiative. The Red Army, once desperate and disorganized, was now a relentless machine powered by the largest industrial miracle in history. For every German soldier killed, another Soviet took his place. For every tank destroyed, two more replaced it. Even German engineers began to whisper, not in admiration, but in awe, that the Soviets had achieved the impossible. They had moved their entire industrial civilization east of the Urals and made it faster. By spring of 1944, the Soviet counteroffensive was a tidal wave. From the Baltic to the Black Sea, the Red Army advanced across recaptured territory. Towns that had burned in 1941 now saw red banners raised over their ruins. The people, gaunt, hollow-eyed survivors, emerged from basements and forests to see the hammer and sickle flying once again. Alexei's tank crew fought through one village after another. In each, they found the same faces, civilians who pressed bread into their hands, who cried when they saw the T-34s return. "Where are you from?" one old woman asked. "Chelyabinsk," Alexei said, smiling. She blinked. "That's far." He nodded. "But our tanks come from even farther." She didn't understand. Few did. How could they know that behind these soldiers stood an entire nation of invisible workers, thousands of kilometers away, whose sweat and hunger fueled every shell, every plate of armor, every ounce of steel that rolled across the steppe? By the summer, the Red Army reached the old Polish border. The soldiers were hardened now, veterans of years of fire. Alexei's Odvaga had survived 6 campaigns. Its paint was scarred, its sides patched with mismatched plates, but its engine still roared like thunder. One night, as his crew camped beside the tank, Alexei looked west, toward the darkness that led to Berlin. He didn't think of glory. He thought of the factory that had built his tank, of the people who worked through winter nights by candlelight, who welded armor in snowstorms and carved their vengeance into steel. They're the real army, he murmured. His gunner, warming his hands over a small fire, nodded. Duh. And we're the bullets. Above them, the aurora shimmered faintly in the night sky, the same green light that danced over the Urals, where more tanks were already being born. The red tide was coming. And no wall of concrete, no river, no empire could stop it now. August 1944, Warsaw, occupied Poland. The air reeked of gasoline and dust. From the upper floors of a shattered apartment block, Oberstleutnant Heinrich Brandt of the Wehrmacht's 4th Panzer Army stared east through his field glasses. The horizon shimmered with heat and smoke. There, beyond the fields, black specks moved like ants, thousands of them. Tanks, trucks, artillery. The Soviet front was rolling forward again, and faster than ever. Heinrich lowered the binoculars, his hands trembling slightly. The reports had warned him, entire German divisions were vanishing under the Soviet advance. Bridges blown up yesterday were already crossed again today. The roads were flooded with civilians, wounded soldiers, and burnt-out wreckage. A messenger burst into the command post, his uniform spattered with mud. Herr Oberstleutnant. Another wave of enemy armor sighted near Seedles. Our forward line is gone, again. Heinrich exhaled slowly. How many tanks? The messenger hesitated. We can't count them. They keep coming. Outside, the rumble of artillery began, a deep, endless rhythm that shook the glass in the windows. It wasn't a bombardment anymore. It was a constant heartbeat of war, one that never stopped, day or night. At that moment, hundreds of kilometers east, the furnaces of the Urals still burned. The winter cold had returned early to Magnitogorsk, but the factory lights never dimmed. Sergei Petrovich stood on a platform overlooking the assembly line, his beard streaked with gray now. Beneath him, T-34s/85 tanks rolled forward in a shining procession, each destined for a different front: Leningrad, Minsk, Warsaw, Budapest. A young engineer approached him, clipboard in hand. Comrade Sergei, we've broken the monthly record again. 1,300 completed tanks. Sergei nodded, though his expression remained weary. He had stopped celebrating numbers. The scale had become incomprehensible. They were no longer building machines, they were forging a tide. The old foreman leaned against the railing, looking down at the sparks that flew like orange rain. When I first came here, he said, we built a tank every few days. Now, we build them faster than the Germans can destroy them. The engineer smiled. That's victory, isn't it? Sergei shook his head. That's survival. Back in Poland, the Germans began to whisper of a new kind of fear. Captured documents revealed the truth that even Berlin had struggled to accept: the Soviet Union's industrial relocation had succeeded beyond imagination. The factories of the Urals, once improvised shelters in the wilderness, had become cities of metal, self-sufficient, connected by endless railways and fueled by labor that never ceased. While Germany's plants in Kassel, Munich, and Essen were flattened by Allied bombs, the Soviet factories lay untouched behind thousands of miles of wilderness. They grew stronger as the war dragged on. Speer wrote in his diary, we miscalculated the Russian. We saw him as backward, incapable of industrial genius. Now his factories hum in places we cannot reach. He builds tanks as we once built dreams. By September, the Red Army had reached the Vistula. The Germans dug in west of Warsaw, praying the river would slow the Soviet tide. But it didn't. At dawn on September 4th, Alexei Volkov's T-34s/85, scarred and dented from a dozen engagements, rolled up a muddy embankment overlooking the river. The engine coughed, then roared back to life. Across the water, he could see the smoke of burning villages. German shells whistled overhead, but the Soviet columns didn't stop. They were too many, too driven, too relentless. Alexei lifted his field binoculars and whispered, almost home. The word home didn't mean comfort anymore. It meant Berlin, The end of the long road east to west, the journey that had begun 3 years ago in the ashes of Moscow. That night, the Soviets prepared to cross the Vistula. Thousands of artillery pieces opened fire in unison, the ground shaking under their barrage. German observers reported seeing the very earth on the far bank boil with explosions. Heinrich Brandt, crouched in a trench, covered his ears and shouted over the roar, "They have endless guns. Endless shells. Where does it all come from?" A shell landed nearby, throwing dirt into his mouth. The young radio operator beside him muttered in disbelief, "They say their factories never stop." "Not for 1 minute." Brandt spat the dirt out, grimacing. "Then God help us all." Hours later, the first Soviet tanks crossed the pontoon bridges, engines growling, turrets glistening with frost. Among them was Odvaga. Alexei's eyes stung from smoke, his hands black with grease. He didn't know where Sergei Petrovich was, or whether the man who'd built his tank still lived, but he whispered anyway, a ritual before battle, "Thank you for the steel." The crossing marked the beginning of the end. Behind the Red Army lay the factories of the East, thousands of miles of machinery, labor, and sacrifice that the Germans had never truly seen. Ahead of them lay Berlin, and between those two worlds, the last defense of the Reich was about to break. October 1944, Chelyabinsk, known now to every Soviet citizen by a single name, Tankograd. Snow fell in thick curtains across the sprawling industrial city. Even the wind smelled of iron and oil. From above, the factory complex looked like an endless maze, rail lines weaving between chimneys, warehouses, and furnaces that never cooled. The glow of molten steel painted the night sky orange, a permanent dawn. Inside one of the massive assembly halls, Sergei Petrovich walked the line one last time before his shift ended. He was older now, slower in his step, heavier in the breath, but his eyes still burned with the same stubborn light. All around him, the sound was deafening, the hammering of rivets, the hiss of welders, the roar of engines being tested for the first time. Women in oil-stained uniforms guided cranes with practiced precision, lowering turrets onto hulls. Boys barely 16 turned wrenches beside them. A foreman shouted above the noise, "Another 10 tanks ready for shipment, Comrade Sergei." Sergei nodded, glancing at the clock. 3 in the morning. The second shift would be ending soon, the third already waiting in the corridor. He ran a hand along the side of one completed T-34/85, its armor plate still warm from welding. The smell of scorched metal mixed with grease and paint. On the turret, someone had written in chalk, "Berlin or bust." Sergei smiled grimly. It wasn't propaganda anymore. It was a promise. Outside, long freight trains idled in the snow, steam rising from their brakes like breath in the cold air. Each flat car carried tanks wrapped in canvas, their silhouettes ghostly under the falling snow. Guards with PPSH submachine guns paced the platforms, their boots crunching over frozen rails. The conductor waved a red flag. A whistle shrieked through the night, and the line of locomotives began to move, westward, always westward. Every few minutes, another train departed. Another convoy. Another battalion of steel. Tankograd alone produced 1,500 tanks a month by late 1944. Alongside them came artillery, shells, engines, and replacement parts, all bound for the front. Soviet logistics officers calculated that a single T-34 took less than 3 working days to assemble. The Germans refused to believe the numbers. It sounded like fantasy, until they saw the reality on the battlefield. On the Eastern Front, near the Vistula River, Oberstleutnant Heinrich Brandt sat in what remained of his command post, a ruined farmhouse now turned into a bunker. The roof had been blasted away, the walls patched with boards and frozen mud. His men were exhausted, faces hollowed by months of retreat. A young lieutenant entered with a tattered map. "Herr Oberstleutnant, reconnaissance reports 3 Soviet tank corps forming up north of our sector." Brandt frowned. "Tank corps? Here? Impossible. They've been fighting non-stop for weeks." "Yes, sir," the officer replied, "but they've been replaced. Entire formations. Overnight. Brant rubbed his temples. He knew it was true. Every day, they destroyed tanks by the dozens, and every morning, new ones appeared. It was like fighting a tide. You could fire into it, but it always came back stronger. That he looked at his men, 20 survivors from what had once been a full company of panzers. The last Tiger in his unit had broken down 2 days ago, out of fuel and spare parts. That he muttered, half to himself, our engineers build masterpieces. There's build victory. Meanwhile, in Tankograd, Sergei received a telegram. It bore the emblem of the People's Commissariat for Defense. That he tore it open with trembling hands. Your son, Junior Lieutenant Viktor Petrovich, fell heroically near Warsaw. His tank destroyed 4 enemy machines before being lost to fire. The motherland honors his sacrifice. Sergei read the lines twice, then sat heavily on a crate. Around him, the clamor of the factory went on, hammers, whistles, the clang of metal. No one noticed him at first. Then one of the young welders approached quietly and placed a hand on his shoulder. Comrade Sergei, he fought in one of your tanks, didn't he? Sergei didn't answer. He just looked up at the glowing ceiling, eyes wet from the heat and grief. After a long silence, he said softly, then I'll build him another. He stood, wiped his face, and went back to work. By November, the Soviet advance had reached the Vistula bridgeheads. The Red Army was gathering strength for what everyone knew was coming, the final drive to Berlin. Across the front, hundreds of new tanks arrived daily. Many bore the same rough chalk messages: for Stalingrad, for Kursk, for my brother, for the Urals. The Germans saw them through their binoculars, hundreds of armored silhouettes appearing on the horizon, and finally understood, this was not a wave that could be stopped. It was an industrial revolution turned into a weapon, forged in the heart of the wilderness, powered by millions who refused to surrender. The war had started with German steel cutting through Soviet soil. Now, it would end with Soviet steel rolling through German streets. January 1945, Lower Silesia, Eastern Germany. Snow fell black that winter, not from soot alone, but from the mingled smoke of war. Entire towns burned beneath the iron-gray sky as the Red Army thundered westward, engines growling like the approach of a storm. The roads were clogged with refugees and retreating Wehrmacht columns, horse-drawn wagons mingling with the twisted remains of panzers. The temperature plunged below -20, but the ground shook with fire. From his command cupola, Sergeant Alexei Volkov squinted through sleet. His T-34/85, Odvaga, now looked nothing like the factory-fresh tank it once was. The paint had peeled, the fenders were torn, the barrel pitted and scarred. But it still moved. Behind him stretched an ocean of armor, tens of thousands of tanks, self-propelled guns, trucks, and infantry sledges. The first Ukrainian front, under Marshal Konyev, was driving straight into the German heartland. Engine check. Alexei shouted over the radio, still running, comrade, came the reply from his driver, grinning despite the cold. She'll reach Berlin before she dies. Alexei laughed hoarsely, but his eyes were hollow. He had seen too much death, friends turned to ash inside burning machines, villages reduced to snow and bone. Yet here he was, still moving forward, still carrying the dream that had begun 3 years ago in the Urals. That he looked west through the periscope. Beyond the mist, the land of their enemy stretched ahead, the soil that had once birthed the Blitzkrieg. Now it was their turn. In Berlin, the war had become numbers on paper. Reich Minister Albert Speer stood before a map marked with red arrows, each arrow representing a Soviet front. They spread like veins toward the heart of Germany. His aide read from a report, estimated Soviet armor approaching 28,000 units. Confirmed production from Eurovagonzavod now exceeds pre-war German totals. Speer leaned forward, his voice low. They've built more tanks than we ever dreamed of, and they're still building them. The aide hesitated. Our own factories, our rubble, Speer finished. Bombed, starved of coal, stripped of men. The Russians turned their wilderness into a furnace. We turned ours into a grave. He walked to the window. Outside, the winter wind rattled against broken glass. We thought they were backward. But they became a mirror, and we no longer recognize what we see. In the Urals, the furnaces still thundered, the snow around Tankograd was blackened with ash, the smokestacks vomiting flame even at midnight. Sergei Petrovich had stopped counting the tanks. Numbers didn't matter anymore, only the movement, the rhythm. The war had consumed everything, his family, his youth, his strength. But his hands still worked, and that was enough. He stood before a completed T-34, its fresh green paint glistening under the lights. On the turret, someone had scrawled in chalk. "For Victor." Sergei traced the letters with a trembling finger. He didn't know who wrote it, maybe a worker who remembered his story, or maybe it was coincidence. Either way, he smiled faintly, tears cutting clean streaks through the grime on his face. Then he turned to the next chassis. There was always another one. Always another. Back in Silesia, Otvaga and her crew pressed forward through smoke and snow. The Germans had no more fuel, no more air cover, no more hope. The once invincible Tigers sat abandoned by the roadside, engines frozen, crews long gone. Alexei's tank rumbled past them, the red star on its turret dulled by soot. At a crossroads near Breslau, the crew halted to refuel. The snow was grey with ash, the smell of burning oil lingered. As they worked, Alexei noticed something on the horizon, a thin black line that shimmered with motion. Another Soviet column. And behind it, another. As far as the eye could see, the landscape crawled with steel. The Red Army had become a living machine, tens of thousands of tanks moving in synchronized fury, born of the same fire that burned in the Urals. Alexei murmured to himself, "Sergei Petrovich, old man, your work made it here." In one of the shattered towns they liberated, the crew found a surviving German mechanic, his face grey with exhaustion. He looked at the T-34s passing by and whispered to no one in particular, "How can you fight a country that builds tanks faster than you can destroy them?" No one answered. The ground shook again as the next Soviet column passed, another battalion of armor heading west. Above them, the black snow fell steadily, silent, endless, the ashes of a dying empire drifting over the advancing tide of the east. The march to Berlin had begun. By February 1945, the earth itself seemed to groan beneath the weight of Soviet steel. From the Vistula to the Oder, the Red Army's armored columns rolled like a living tide, 41,000 tanks and self-propelled guns grinding westward over frozen fields, through villages that no longer had names, past forests stripped bare by war. And the command maps of Marshal Zhukov and Marshal Konyev. The war was now geometry, arrows, fronts, flanks. But on the ground, it was still mud, hunger, and men fighting to stay alive one more day. Inside Otvaga, Sergeant Alexei Volkov and his crew moved in silence. The smell of oil and cordite never left the steel shell of their home. Their clothes were stiff with soot, their breath turning to mist inside their helmets. When they crossed into Germany, the driver, young Mikhail, muttered, "So this is it. We're on their soil now." No one answered. They all remembered what had happened when the Germans first came to theirs. The villages burned, the children shot, the women dragged into barns. No one forgot that as they rolled through the ruins of a small town near Kustrin, Alexei saw graffiti scrawled on a half-collapsed wall, "Redakten, der Winter wird sie stoppen." We thought winter would stop them. He almost laughed. Winter had been their forge. Meanwhile, in the bunkers of Berlin, Hitler's generals argued over maps that no longer mattered. Colonel General Heinrichs I warned that the Soviets were massing along the Oder, only 70 kilometers from the capital. His words were met with silence. The Führer, his hands trembling, jabbed a finger at the map. "They will never reach Berlin. Steiner's army will counterattack." But Steiner's army was a ghost, a handful of broken divisions, half of them teenagers. The rooms smelled of smoke and defeat. At dawn on April 16, 1945, the sky east of Berlin erupted into artificial day. Thousands of Soviet guns, 20,000 in all, opened fire in unison. The bombardment was so intense that the air itself vibrated, the frozen ground turning to liquid mud. For half an hour, the night burned white. Then, through the smoke, the tanks began to move. Alexei gripped the hatch rim as Odvaga lurched forward, its tracks grinding over shattered earth. The roar of engines merged into one endless metallic thunder. Ahead, the Silo Heights, the last great barrier before Berlin, rose like a black wall under the dawn. Driver, full throttle. Alexei shouted, "Full throttle, comrade." The tank plunged into the storm, shells burst around them, soil raining on the armor. German 88s opened fire from hidden ridges, cutting gaps in the Soviet columns. Tanks exploded in orange flashes, crews crawled out screaming, only to vanish in the mud. Still, they advanced. When Odvaga crested the first slope, Alexei saw the battlefield stretch before him like the end of the world, rivers of fire and steel. Behind every tank destroyed, another took its place. Behind every man who fell, another ran forward with a red flag. It was no longer a battle of tactics. It was a test of will. Back in the Urals, Sergei Petrovich listened to the radio in the factory canteen. The broadcast was faint, distorted by static, but one word came through clearly: Berlin. Around him, the workers froze. For a moment, no one spoke. Then someone began to clap, slowly, awkwardly. Another joined in, and another, until the sound became a thunder of hands against rough wood. Tears filled Sergei's eyes. He looked at his grease-stained hands, the same hands that had shaped the steel, turned the bolts, fitted the engines that were now rolling into Germany. He whispered, "Go, my children. End it." At Silo, the fight turned into chaos. German guns fired point-blank into the advancing tanks. Soviet artillery answered with fire so dense that whole hillsides vanished in dust. The T-34s clawed through craters, their tracks glowing red-hot. Inside Odvaga, the gunner shouted, "Target. Anti-tank gun, 2 o'clock." The cannon thundered. The German position disappeared in a burst of smoke, then a shell slammed into Odvaga's flank. The tank lurched violently, alarms screaming. Engine hit. The driver yelled, "We've lost pressure. Keep firing." Alexei ordered. "We're almost through." The loader rammed another shell into the breach. The gun barked again, and again. Outside, the horizon burned. 3 days later, the Silo Heights fell, the road to Berlin lay open. As the Soviet columns regrouped, Alexei climbed out of his damaged tank and looked west. The sky glowed red over the horizon, the reflection of the burning city, Berlin, the place where everything had begun, and where everything would end. He turned to his crew. Their faces were blackened with soot, their eyes hollow with exhaustion, but they were smiling. "Let's finish it," Alexei said, and together, they rolled toward the fire. April 25, 1945, outskirts of Berlin, the air hung thick with smoke and dust, the smell of burning fuel, cordite, and crushed stone mingling into something that no soldier ever forgot. The streets were clogged with the carcasses of once great machines, wrecked Panthers, overturned trucks, crumpled streetcars, and then, among them, the T-34s appeared. They came in lines, dozens wide, their green hulls glistening under soot and firelight. To Berliners hiding in basements, they sounded like rolling thunder, a mechanical storm that had crossed half the world to reach them. Inside Odvaga, Sergeant Alexei Volkov kept his eyes fixed on the periscope. His crew was silent now, they had long run out of words. Every corner could hide a Panzerfaust, every window a sniper. "Left," he murmured to the driver. "Watch the rubble." As the tank turned onto Wilhelmstrasse, the radio hissed, "Attention all units, Reichstag in sight." They had reached the heart of the Third Reich. Around them, Berlin disintegrated. Soviet artillery fired from every street corner, blasting the city block by block. The Germans fought with everything they had left, old men, boys, even the wounded. From a ruined balcony, a German officer in a scorched greatcoat raised his binoculars. He had once been at Kursk, years ago, when his Tiger division had laughed at the idea that Soviet factories could outbuild them. Now he saw the truth with his own eyes. hundreds of T-34s, advancing from every direction that he lowered the binoculars, expression hollow. They built them faster than we could burn them, he said quietly. A nearby soldier asked, "Sir?" He didn't answer. At the Reichstag, Alexei's unit was pinned by heavy fire. The square was a cauldron of flame. T-34s maneuvered through shell holes, crushing barricades under their tracks. Infantry followed close behind, taking cover behind the armor's broad flanks. The commander's voice cracked through the radio, "Forward. Raise the banner. The motherland is watching." Alexei's driver gunned the engine. Odvaga surged forward, its hull scraping over fallen masonry. Machine gun fire rattled off the turret like hail. When the tank halted before the shattered steps of the Reichstag, Alexei climbed out. His legs trembled as he hit the ground. Above him, the German flag still clung stubbornly to a twisted pole. He looked up, and saw Soviet infantrymen racing up the steps, red banner in hand. The sound of their boots echoed through the ruin. Moments later, the flag rose, and as it unfurled in the smoky wind, a cheer erupted from every radio, every trench, every factory still alive east of the Urals. The war in Europe was ending, thousands of miles away. In Tankigrad, the factory sirens wailed not for an air raid, but for victory. Yelena Korotkova stood among the workers on the assembly floor, listening as the factory loudspeaker crackled, "Comrades! Berlin has fallen. The red banner flies over the Reichstag." The roar that followed shook the walls. Men and women embraced, cried, shouted, sang, and yet, many, like Yelena, simply stood in silence. For her, the victory was too vast, too costly. Her brother had died outside Leningrad. Her father never returned from a Siberian rail camp, but in her heart, she felt something else, the strange, heavy pride of knowing that every tank she had welded, every plate she had hammered, had helped end this nightmare. A week later, the surviving crews of the 1st Guards tank army gathered in Berlin's ruins for a photograph. Alexei stood in front of Odvaga. Its armor was pitted, scorched, streaked with dried mud. But it still stood. The photographer adjusted his lens, capturing a moment that would outlast them all, the men of steel beside the machines that had carried them through hell. When the shutter clicked, Alexei turned to his crew. "We did it," he said softly. The driver, Mikhail, smiled faintly. "And we never stopped building." In the months that followed, Germany lay in ruins, and across the Ural Mountains, the furnaces finally cooled. The forges that had burned night and day for 4 years went silent. The workers slept through entire days for the first time in memory, yet the machines remained. Thousands of T-34s, the humble, rugged, unstoppable children of a nation's will, now stood rusting in the sun across Europe, silent witnesses to the war they had ended. Years later, in 1965, a young factory worker in Nizhny Tagil walked through a small museum display. In the center stood a restored T-34, paint-polished, gun still scarred. A plaque read, "Built in Tankigrad, 1942. Fought from Stalingrad to Berlin." He ran his hand along its side. The steel was cool, but beneath it, he could almost feel the heartbeat of those who had built and driven it. That it was more than a tank. It was the sound of hammers in the snow, the roar of furnaces in the dark, the echo of a nation refusing to die, because in the end, the Soviets had not only fought the Germans, they had fought time, distance, and annihilation itself, and won through endurance, not just courage. They built faster than the enemy could destroy, they turned exile into industry, and through smoke, fire, and steel, they forged victory.